Hipparete, a name barely whispered in the annals of history, overshadowed by the brilliance and notoriety of her husband, Alcibiades. Athens remembers Alcibiades as a war hero, a traitor, a visionary, and a man of scandal. He was a force of nature, one who shaped the course of the Peloponnesian War, manipulating alliances and defying expectations. But few ever ask, what of his wife? Hipparete was more than a silent observer to the whirlwind of Athens' most turbulent years. She was born into one of the wealthiest and most influential families of the city. The daughter of Hipponicus, a man whose fortune and status were unparalleled. She married Alcibiades not as a matter of love but as a calculated move, ensuring the union of her family's wealth with his insatiable ambition. But in a world dominated by men, where women were confined to their homes and expected to remain voiceless, how much power could she truly wield? This is the untold story of Hipparete, the woman behind Alcibiades. The woman who endured humiliation, betrayal, and tragedy, yet whose choices, whether deliberate or forced upon her, altered the course of history. She was a noble Athenian, a dutiful wife, and a mother, but she was also something else, a force, however silent, that shaped the destiny of her infamous husband and the city they called home. Her story does not begin in the halls of power or the battlefield. Nor does it begin with grand speeches or ambitious conquests. It begins in the quiet shadows, in the place where Athenian women existed, unseen yet ever present. The agora bustled with life, its marble colonnades echoing with the chatter of merchants, politicians, and philosophers. It was the heart of Athens, the place where policies were debated, fortunes were made, and power was exchanged with a mere flick of the wrist or the whisper of a well-placed word. But it was not a place for women. Hipparete, like all noble Athenian women, was confined to the home, a grand estate inherited from her father. She lived behind its towering walls, in the women's quarters, where she oversaw the household slaves, embroidered fine linen, and prepared for the sacred rituals expected of Athenian wives. But unlike the women around her, she did not grow up dreaming of such a life. She had seen her father negotiate with generals, witnessed the strategic discussions that shaped Athenian politics. She understood power, not in the way men wielded it with swords and speeches, but in the way it could be used quietly. From the shadows, her marriage to Alcibiades was inevitable. He was young, handsome, and ambitious beyond measure. Though an orphan, he was raised in the household of Pericles, Athens' greatest statesman. He possessed charm, intellect, and above all, an insatiable hunger for greatness. Yet, for all his brilliance, he lacked one thing: resources. That was what Hipparete brought to their marriage. The vast fortune of her father provided Alcibiades with the means to finance his ambitions. And Athens took notice. At first, their union seemed to be one of balance. Alcibiades, ever the public figure, thrived in the political arena, while Hipparete maintained the sanctity of their household. But as the years passed, the cracks in their marriage began to show. Alcibiades, never one for fidelity, entertained mistresses and courted scandal, disregarding the shame it brought upon his wife. Athens, for all its democracy, was unforgiving to women. While men could indulge in excesses without consequence, women bore the brunt of the disgrace. Hipparete's name was whispered with pity in the women's quarters and with amusement in the symposiums where men drank and laughed at Alcibiades' exploits. But she endured, as Athenian women always did. She held her head high, raising their children and managing their estate, while her husband fought battles not just on the field, but in the political landscape of Greece itself. Yet there came a time when even the most patient of wives could not endure. When Alcibiades was accused of desecrating the sacred statues of Hermes, the scandal that would lead to his first exile, Hipparete found herself at the center of a storm she had never wished for. The whispers turned to outright ridicule, and Athens, once captivated by Alcibiades' charisma, turned against him. For the first time, Hipparete made a decision that was entirely her own. She sought divorce, not for love, nor for personal freedom. Both were foreign concepts to Athenian women, but for dignity. She could endure humiliation no longer. Yet Alcibiades, ever the master of manipulation, would not allow it. He intercepted her, seizing her in the most public of places, the very courts where she had gone to plead her case. Before the watchful eyes of Athens, he dragged her back to their home, an act both audacious and terrifying. This moment, though seemingly insignificant compared to the grand battles and shifting alliances of the Peloponnesian War, was one of the many small, unseen moments that shaped the fate of Athens. Alcibiades may have wielded power, but he was also shaped by the forces around him, by men who envied him, by enemies who sought to destroy him, and by a wife who, despite all odds, remained an unspoken pillar in his life. Hipparete's story is not one of heroism in the traditional sense. She did not lead armies, nor did she speak in the assembly, but her existence, her choices, and even her silence shaped the course of events in ways history seldom acknowledges. This is her story, a story of power unseen, of loyalty tested, and of a woman who, despite being confined to the shadows, cast a long and lasting shadow over one of history's most enigmatic figures. Hipparete's birth was not celebrated as a momentous occasion in the grand halls of Athens. She was born into privilege. Yet, as a daughter, she was never meant to wield true power. Her father, Hipparete, was among the wealthiest men in the city, a man whose fortune granted him influence over both politics and military affairs. His wealth was vast: landed estates, lucrative trade networks, and connections with the most influential figures of Athens. In another world, another time, Hipparete might have inherited his empire, shaping Athenian history in ways unimaginable. But in Athens, a woman's fate was never truly her own. From an early age, she was raised to understand the expectations placed upon her. Her childhood was spent within the confines of her family's estate, where she was taught the arts of domestic management, weaving, and religious duties, while Athenian boys were sent to study philosophy and rhetoric, preparing for their future roles as statesmen and warriors. Girls like Hipparete were trained for one purpose: to marry well. And marry well, she did. Alcibiades was not an ordinary man. Even as a child, he was a spectacle, his beauty and charisma setting him apart from his peers. Raised in the household of Pericles, the greatest statesman of Athens, Alcibiades was accustomed to power from an early age. He was reckless, ambitious, and utterly captivating. Even Socrates, the wisest of men, had been drawn to him, attempting to guide him toward virtue. But Alcibiades was not a man who could be contained by philosophy or reason. He belonged to the world, and the world bent to his will. For all his talents, however, Alcibiades lacked the one thing that could cement his place in Athens: wealth. His family name was noble, his connections enviable, but his fortune had dwindled. He needed resources to fund his ambitions. And that was where Hipparete entered the equation. The marriage was arranged, as all noble unions were, a calculated decision rather than a matter of affection. Hipparete saw in Alcibiades a rising star, and Alcibiades saw in Hipparete a key to unlocking the vast riches of her family. The union brought him immediate prestige, allowing him access to the economic power that would fuel his political and military career. For Hipparete, the marriage was a different kind of transaction. She gained status as the wife of Athens' most promising young leader. But she also inherited the burdens that came with it. She understood, even then, that her role would be one of silent endurance. While Alcibiades charmed the assembly and commanded armies, she would manage their estate, bear his children, and uphold the honor of their household. Yet, from the very beginning, there were signs that her husband was no ordinary Athenian. He was reckless with his affections, indulging in affairs that were neither secret nor discreet. His name was whispered in every corner of the city, not just for his military brilliance but for his scandals. He openly courted courtesans, entertained women in their home, and flaunted his disregard for convention. For an Athenian woman, whose honor was tied to her husband's behavior, it was a public humiliation. Hipparete endured. She had no choice. To leave Alcibiades was unthinkable. Divorce, while legally possible for an Athenian woman, carried social consequences that were often unbearable. A divorced woman could be returned to her family, stripped of her children, and left in disgrace. Even her dowry, her rightful inheritance, would remain in her husband's possession. And Hipparete had more to consider than just her own fate. She was the daughter of Hipponicus, a man whose influence reached into the highest circles of Athenian society. Her actions, no matter how justified, would reflect upon her entire lineage. And so, she played the role expected of her. She hosted the wives of influential men, managed the household affairs, and ensured that their children were raised in accordance with Athenian tradition. She performed the sacred rites dedicated to the gods, maintaining the religious duties required of an aristocratic woman. She was the picture of an ideal wife. But beneath the surface, she was watching, learning. She saw how men like her father and husband maneuvered through the political landscape, wielding power not just through war, but through alliances, whispers, and well-placed gestures. She understood that true influence was not always wielded by the loudest voice in the assembly but by those who controlled the wealth that sustained it. She was not like the women who lived in quiet submission. She had been raised among men of consequence. She had seen the inner workings of Athenian politics, the games played behind closed doors, the strategies that determined the fate of nations. And she knew that if she was to survive in a world ruled by men like Alcibiades, she could not simply be a passive observer. She would endure, but she would also shape the course of her own fate, in ways no one, perhaps not even Alcibiades, could have anticipated. This was just the beginning. The streets of Athens were a constant whirlwind of political machinations, where orators stood on the steps of the assembly, and generals paraded through the agora, seeking support for their latest military campaign. It was a world where men's ambitions soared as high as the marble columns of the Parthenon, and where power was not simply granted, it was seized, fought for, and protected at all costs. Alcibiades, with his charm and boundless energy, was perfectly suited for this world. But while the streets echoed with his name, Hipparete's world remained confined to the quieter spaces of their home, an environment where her power, though subtle, was ever present. Alcibiades' rise was nothing short of meteoric. Born to a noble family, yet lacking the wealth of some of Athens' wealthiest men, he had always been a man of ambition. From his youth, he exhibited an uncanny ability to win the favor of those in power. His status as the ward of Pericles, Athens' most influential statesman, granted him a unique position in the city's elite circles. Yet it was not merely his connections that propelled him forward. Alcibiades had a charisma that could persuade, charm, and manipulate the most powerful men of his time. He was an Athenian in the truest sense, brash, brilliant, and daring. In the years following their marriage, Hipparete watched as Alcibiades maneuvered through the political sphere with remarkable ease. The alliances he formed were not simply with fellow politicians or generals, they extended into the very heart of Athens' military elite. His success was propelled by his ability to play both sides, cultivating relationships with key figures in Athens, Sparta, and Persia. In every move, Alcibiades crafted a strategy, a delicate web of loyalty and deceit, one that would ensure his place at the top of Athenian politics. It was no surprise when Alcibiades became a general, taking command of Athens' most ambitious military campaign, the Sicilian expedition. The campaign was to be Athens' greatest attempt to expand its empire. And Alcibiades, with his boundless ambition, was the ideal figure to lead it. He was charismatic, a natural leader, and he inspired those around him to follow him into battle, to believe in his vision of a victorious Athens. He saw in Sicily not just a military conquest but an opportunity to elevate himself to a position of unprecedented power. If successful, the campaign could solidify Athens' dominance in the Mediterranean and secure his legacy as one of the greatest military minds in history. For Hipparete, this was both a time of pride and unease. She had always known that Alcibiades' ambition was limitless, that he saw power not just as a means to secure his wealth but as a force that could elevate him to the status of a ruler, to become something greater than any of his predecessors. She had watched his speeches, heard him rally the people of Athens with words that stirred the very soul of the city. He was the voice of the future, a future he believed he alone could shape. Yet, as Alcibiades became the face of the Sicilian expedition, Hipparete found herself slipping further into the background. The man who had once needed her fortune to elevate his status was now a figure so powerful that even the richest families in Athens seemed insignificant in comparison. She had become one of the many women who sat behind closed doors, watching her husband's name echo across the city's walls. Though she lived in the shadows of his grandeur, her role was no less vital. The household she had worked so tirelessly to maintain allowed Alcibiades to focus on his ambitions. Her absence from the public eye became part of the invisible machinery that allowed his career to flourish. Alcibiades' rise did not go unnoticed by the men who ruled Athens. His success was as thrilling as it was dangerous. He was young, bold, and a master of rhetoric. He had supporters who saw him as a visionary, the future of Athens, but he also made enemies, men who saw him as a threat to their own power. In the world of Athenian politics, alliances were often temporary, and loyalties were fickle. Alcibiades' enemies waited for the moment when they could strike, when they could tear him down. And as the Sicilian expedition began to falter, those enemies found their moment. The campaign, initially hailed as a great triumph, became a disaster. The fleet was lost, the soldiers disbanded, and Athens' once unshakable confidence began to crumble. The assembly, seeking someone to blame, turned on Alcibiades. His enemies, eager to see his downfall, accused him of sacrilege, of desecrating sacred statues of Hermes. A crime that, in Athens, was unforgivable. It was in the wake of this scandal that Alcibiades was summoned back to Athens to stand trial. The once untouchable hero was now a man on the run, facing charges that could ruin him. It was a crisis unlike any Athens had faced before. The political climate shifted. Those who had once celebrated his victories now turned on him in the blink of an eye. Alcibiades, desperate to avoid punishment, fled Athens and sought refuge in Sparta. In the midst of this political storm, Hipparete found herself caught between loyalty and disgrace. Her husband, once the darling of Athens, was now a pariah. Yet, even as he fled, even as he sought shelter in the arms of Sparta's enemies, she remained in Athens. She had no choice. To leave her family's legacy behind would have been an unimaginable disgrace. But even as the walls of their world crumbled, she did not break. She continued to maintain the household, ensuring that their children were cared for, their estates guarded. The man who had promised her greatness and security had now become the very thing that threatened it all. Alcibiades had risen to power by making bold choices, but those choices came with consequences. And as his world unraveled, Hipparete's silence became her strongest defense. Athens had turned its back on Alcibiades, but Hipparete was not yet ready to turn her back on him. She had long understood that power was not a thing easily won or easily lost. She had borne the weight of his ambitions, the strain of his scandals, and the consequences of his actions. She knew that the path ahead was uncertain, that Alcibiades' fate was no longer in her hands. But even as her husband faced exile and disgrace, Hipparete's role in shaping their future had yet to be determined. What would she do now? In the face of such uncertainty? What could she do, as Athens stood on the brink of losing one of its most brilliant and controversial figures? For now, she would endure. She would remain the silent force behind Alcibiades, the woman who had long watched, long waited, and who would continue to play a role in the grand game of Athenian politics, even if history would never fully acknowledge her. The sun had barely risen over Athens when the news of Alcibiades' fall from grace reached every corner of the city. The vibrant streets, once buzzing with excitement over the daring Sicilian expedition, now felt eerily still. The promise of victory, of Athens' expansion and dominance, had dissolved like mist in the morning light, leaving behind only the bitter scent of failure and disgrace. Alcibiades, the man who had been hailed as the savior of Athens, now found himself a fugitive, his name sullied by accusations of sacrilege and betrayal. Hipparete, ever the dutiful wife, had been silent throughout the tumult. Her life had been overshadowed by Alcibiades' ambition from the very beginning. And now, as the political landscape of Athens turned against him, she faced a new kind of humiliation. Her husband, once the brightest star in Athens' constellation, was now accused of defiling the sacred statues of Hermes. a crime that struck at the heart of Athenian piety and values. For the citizens of Athens, this was not just a political scandal, it was an attack on their very identity, their gods, and their way of life. Yet, as Athens clamored for retribution, Hipparete remained composed, her emotions veiled by the stoic role of the Athenian wife. She knew that, while her husband's name could be dragged through the mud, the reputation of her family could not be easily erased. Her father's wealth, her connections to the nobility, and the very blood of Athens ran through her veins. She was the daughter of Hipparete, and her status, though precarious, was not without power, but power had limits. Alcibiades' trial, if it had ever come to fruition, would have been a spectacle. The assembly was in an uproar, eager to see their former champion brought to justice. His enemies were quick to stoke the flames of his betrayal, casting him as a traitor to the city that had once adored him. But even as the mob called for his head, Alcibiades was nowhere to be found. Fearing the worst, he had fled Athens in the dead of night, leaving behind the city that had once been his to command. Hipparete, caught between loyalty and humiliation, found herself standing at a crossroads. She had been a silent observer for most of her marriage, always at the periphery of the drama that unfolded around her husband. But now, as he fled into exile, she had to face the reality of her situation. She was alone in a city that had turned its back on her family. Her husband was branded a criminal, a fugitive, and she had no choice but to remain in Athens, her life now a reflection of the scandal that had engulfed him. She knew what would happen next. The whispers would start, first behind closed doors, then in the open air of the agora. Athens would turn its gaze to her, the woman who had been married to the man who had betrayed them all. Her reputation, carefully built over the years, would be tainted by the very association with Alcibiades. But still, she remained composed, managing their estate, overseeing the care of their children, and waiting for Alcibiades to return, if he ever did. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Alcibiades had not returned, and Athens showed no signs of relenting in its condemnation of him. The assembly had declared him an outlaw, and his name was struck from the records. He had gone from the hero of Athens to a symbol of its deepest shame. Yet even as Athens sought to erase his memory, Hipparete never gave up hope. Her husband had been many things, reckless, ambitious, and often cruel, but he had also been a man of great intellect and drive. She could not, in good conscience, believe that his story had ended so abruptly, so ignominiously. In the meantime, Alcibiades had found refuge in the city of Sparta, Athens' bitter rival. It was a place that could not have been further from the home he had known. A place filled with enemies who would welcome his talents only so long as they served their own interests. The Spartans, eager to exploit Athens' loss, welcomed him into their fold, using him to advise on military strategy and hoping to turn the tide in their favor during the Peloponnesian War. But even in the enemy camp, Alcibiades was no mere servant. He was a man of influence, a man who had seen both the heights of Athenian power and the depths of its downfall. As he made his way through Spartan halls, advising their generals and engaging in political intrigues, Alcibiades could not escape the shadow of Athens. He knew that his fate was sealed, that he could never return to the city that had once loved him. He had burned too many bridges, betrayed too many allies, and defiled too many sacred oaths. And yet, he still held onto a flicker of hope that, one day, he would return to Athens, that his exile would not be permanent. The world of politics was a fickle one, and Alcibiades knew that anything could happen. But what of Hipparete? What did her life look like as her husband fought for survival on foreign soil? She had borne the humiliation of his scandal, had weathered the storm of his exile. But now, more than ever, she felt the weight of her isolation. Athens had not forgotten her, nor would it ever forget the name of her husband. The days grew longer, and Hipparete found herself in a liminal space, neither fully part of Athens nor fully apart from it. She remained in her home, a silent witness to the world around her, watching as the tides of politics shifted once again. But she had no voice in these matters. She was a woman, confined to the private sphere, unable to influence the decisions that shaped the city's fate. And yet, despite the growing sense of despair, There was a part of Hipparete that understood. She understood the nature of power, its fragility, and its transience. She understood that Alcibiades, for all his brilliance, was not invincible. His rise to power had been marked by ambition and brilliance, but it had also been marked by betrayal and arrogance. The very qualities that had propelled him to greatness were the same ones that had brought him to ruin. Hipparete could not change the course of her husband's fate, but she could control her own. In the absence of Alcibiades, she took the reins of their household once again, ensuring that their children were cared for and that their estate remained intact. She would survive, as she had always done, in silence and in the shadows. She would endure the consequences of her husband's actions, but she would not be defined by them. As the months wore on, Hipparete realized that her husband's absence was not a death sentence. It was a challenge to prove that she, too, had the strength to endure, to rise above the politics of Athens, and to ensure the survival of her family. Alcibiades might have been the figurehead, the one who commanded armies and shaped the course of history, but it was Hipparete who would preserve their legacy. She would not be forgotten. Alcibiades' exile marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would forever change the course of their lives. For Hipparete, the journey ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to take. And though she had no voice in the public sphere, she would find a way to ensure that her story, too, would be remembered. The days grew colder in Athens as the seasons shifted, and the whispers of Alcibiades' betrayal slowly morphed into a harsh, relentless gale. Athens, a city once buoyed by the vision and charisma of Alcibiades, had found new heroes to champion, and with that, a new direction for the war effort. But for Hipparete, the city's indifference was as much a wound as the public betrayal of her husband. Though she remained in the shadows of her private life, her world was far from peaceful. The streets, filled with the clamor of war and politics, were a constant reminder that her fate was no longer her own. Her once elegant home, now a quiet residence filled with the dull hum of routine, seemed to mock her in its silence. It was here that she had once played the part of the dutiful wife, watching as Alcibiades' life unraveled before her eyes. Yet she had never imagined the depths to which she herself would be dragged. Alcibiades' sudden disappearance from Athens had left her in a precarious position. He was her protector, her source of power, his name, once a mark of influence, now a stain on her own reputation. As the news of his exile spread throughout the city, so did the judgment, and it was not long before the eyes of Athens turned to her. Every passing day felt like an examination, with her every movement scrutinized by both the public and her peers. The noble families that once stood by her side now avoided her gaze, unwilling to be associated with the scandalous fall of Alcibiades. Even the most powerful women of Athens, who had once treated her with the courtesy due to a wife of the city's leading figure, now turned their backs. The whispers had grown sharper, and in every public interaction, Hipparete could feel the sting of their words. Her own friends, women who had once been allies, now seemed uncertain in her presence, casting her glances that suggested pity more than sympathy. For what could they say to a woman who had been so publicly humiliated? Alcibiades, once the shining jewel of Athens, had now become the embodiment of betrayal. The accusations leveled against him were not just political, they were personal. To be married to a man who had desecrated the gods, to stand by a husband whose very existence threatened the sanctity of Athenian values. How could Hipparete reconcile with such a life? How could she face the city that had once worshipped him, and still claimed to be his wife? But it was not only the judgment of Athens that weighed upon her. The real dilemma, the one that gnawed at her in the quiet solitude of her home, was the question of her own loyalty. Should she stand by Alcibiades as his wife, and support him in his exile? Or should she abandon him, remove herself from the stain of his name, and preserve what was left of her dignity? She could have chosen the latter, walked away from her marriage, and left him to rot in the wilderness of exile. It would have been a choice many would have understood. After all, her reputation, her very life, had been tied to the man who had betrayed Athens in the most egregious manner. Yet, even in the darkest moments of her contemplation, Hipparete could not bring herself to make that decision. The bonds of marriage, for all their imperfections, had been forged not merely by love but by duty. She had stood beside Alcibiades through every victory and every scandal. To abandon him now, when he had fallen the farthest, would be a betrayal she could not commit. Her father's influence, once so crucial in securing her marriage to Alcibiades, now weighed heavily upon her. Hipparete had provided her with wealth and status, but he had also placed her on a precarious pedestal. She was a woman of power only as long as she was married to a man of power. Without Alcibiades, what was she? What was the daughter of Hipparete? The woman whose family had built its name through alliances with powerful men. Without the protection of her husband's ambition? Alone, in a city that was eager to forget both her and her husband. She had no answers. Still, despite the temptation to flee, despite the voices of those who whispered that she should free herself from the chains of her marriage, Hipparete remained in Athens. She kept their estate, and she continued to raise their children with the same care and attention she had always given them. The household was her domain, and she would not let it slip into chaos. Alcibiades, despite his betrayal and exile, was still the father of her children. He had given them his name, and they would carry it with dignity, even if Athens could not. And then, there were the letters. Alcibiades, in the months that followed his departure, had not forgotten her. He had written to her from his refuge in Sparta, and then from Persia, as he sought to rebuild his life and carve a new path. His words were not those of a man broken by exile but of a man determined to return. His letters, full of promises and political machinations, were filled with a strange blend of affection and ambition. He spoke of plans for the future, of schemes that could bring him back into the fold of Athenian power. And in every letter, he implored her to remain loyal, to stand firm. The words in those letters were like a double-edged sword. On one hand, they reminded Hipparete of the man she had married, the ambitious, charismatic Alcibiades who had once promised her the world. But on the other hand, they were a constant reminder of the weight of her choices. He was asking her to be patient, to wait for him as he worked his way back into the good graces of the Athenian world. But could she continue to endure the ridicule, the judgment, and the isolation? Could she live a life tethered to a man who had betrayed her city, whose actions had brought such shame upon them both? At times, Hipparete could almost feel the weight of the decision pressed down upon her chest, suffocating her. She had been raised to be strong, to endure hardship with grace. But even the strongest women had their limits. It was during these moments of doubt that she would find herself standing by the window, gazing out over the city she had once known, wondering if there was any way back for her, any way for her to reclaim her life beyond the shadow of Alcibiades. But the answer, as always, was elusive. Despite the internal turmoil, Hipparete did not relent. She chose to stand by her husband, even as the walls of their world seemed to close in around her. In her silence, she found strength. In her struggle, she found purpose. And though Athens had forgotten the power of the Alcibiades name, Hipparete knew something the city had long since forgotten: the quiet resilience of a woman who had chosen to stay, to fight, and to protect what remained of her family's legacy. Time passed slowly in Athens. The city, once vibrant with the fervor of its war efforts and political intrigues, now felt strangely hollow. The streets, which had echoed with the promises of greatness under Alcibiades' leadership, now whispered only of his downfall. The once flourishing fortune of his name had been reduced to little more than a scandal. Hipparete, living in the quiet shadows of her private life, felt the full weight of that scandal every day. The city had moved on, but for her, the past still clung like a heavy cloak. Her life, once filled with the bustle of social events, political gatherings, and the planning of grand feasts, was now reduced to the muted rhythms of domesticity. The walls of her estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, seemed to close in around her as the days turned into months. Alcibiades had not returned, and despite the letters he sent from his exile, filled with promises of a future retribution, there was an unmistakable sense of finality in the air. The man who had once been the pride of Athens, the great general and charismatic leader, now seemed distant and unreachable. a memory that the city wished to forget and that Hipparete could not escape. For many, the exile of Alcibiades would have marked the end of their journey. They would have sought refuge in the quiet corners of the city, far from the taint of scandal. Some would have remarried, securing their place in the Athenian elite once again. But Hipparete had no such luxury. Her family's legacy, her father's wealth, and the bonds of her marriage had been irrevocably altered by her husband's actions. And now, she faced the tragic reality of her position. A woman whose name would forever be linked to her husband's disgrace, whose life would be defined by his failure. But even as Athens turned its back on them both, Hipparete's sense of duty remained unbroken. She had borne the weight of her marriage's public humiliation for so long. But it was not just her own dignity she fought for, it was the dignity of her children. The future of the family that had once been destined for greatness. She could not afford to fall into despair. Not when her children needed her strength. Not when her estate required her attention. Despite everything, despite the heartbreak and the isolation, Hipparete held herself together. The pressure, however, was beginning to show. The constant scrutiny of the citizens of Athens had taken its toll. The whispers had not ceased. And the cruel remarks about her husband's infidelity and sacrilege still echoed in the circles she moved in. But it was the judgment of the women of Athens that had hurt her the most. They had been her peers, her companions in a city where power and influence were often determined by one's social circle. But now, those women treated her with pity, even disdain. They spoke of her with a kind of detached sympathy, as though she were a relic of a bygone era, a reminder of a time when Alcibiades had been the pride of Athens. In the quiet of her home, when the sounds of the city were muted and her children had gone to bed, Hipparete often found herself reflecting on the life she had lost. Her marriage had been one of convenience, yes, but also one of great potential. With Alcibiades by her side, she had seen a future filled with political power, a future where their children would walk in the footsteps of the city's greatest leaders. Yet, now that future was uncertain, tainted by the stain of Alcibiades' disgrace. The love she had once felt for him had faded into the background, obscured by the many betrayals and disappointments that had followed in the wake of his ambition. Yet even now, in his absence, she could not help but hold on to a glimmer of the man she had married. The man who had been charming, brilliant, and fearless. The man who had promised her the world. The man who, in his fall from grace, had left her to pick up the pieces of their shattered dreams. But the tragedy of Hipparete's situation was not just that she had lost the man she had once known. It was that she had become a woman defined by her husband's failures. In the eyes of Athens, she was no longer Hipparete, the daughter of Hipponicus, the noble woman of Athens. She was simply the wife of Alcibiades, the traitor, the exiled fugitive. She was the woman who had stood by a man who had desecrated the sacred statues of Hermes. The woman who had turned her back on the city in its time of need. The tragedy of Hipparete was the tragedy of all women who had been bound to the ambitions of men. She had no agency in the eyes of Athens, no voice in the narrative of her own life. She was relegated to the private sphere, where her worth was measured not by her own actions but by the actions of her husband. And yet, despite the heartbreak, despite the indignity, Hipparete endured. She held her head high, not because she believed in the future of Athens, but because she had no other choice. Her resilience became her only weapon. She was no longer the wife of Alcibiades, she was simply a woman of Athens, struggling to maintain what little was left of her dignity and her family's legacy. Her life was not one of fame or fortune, but of quiet endurance. It was a life lived in the shadows of history, unnoticed by most, but still a life that had meaning. As the years wore on, Hipparete's name faded further into the background. The world moved on, as it always did, and the city of Athens found new heroes to worship, new villains to condemn. But Hipparete, though forgotten by most, lived on in the quiet corners of her life. Her children, the legacy of Alcibiades, grew up in a world that was different from the one their father had envisioned. They would never know the grandeur of his political empire, nor the glory of his military victories. Instead, they would know a different Athens, one that had moved beyond their father's betrayal, one that had forgotten their mother's quiet strength. And so, the tragedy of Hipparete unfolded, a tragedy not of loss, but of survival. She was not a woman who sought the limelight, nor was she a woman who desired to reclaim the power that had once been hers by virtue of her husband's ambition. No, Hipparete's tragedy was that she lived in a world that had no place for her. No place for the quiet strength of a woman who had stood by her husband through the highs and lows of Athenian politics. She was a woman forgotten by history. But she was also a woman who had endured in silence, carrying the weight of a family's dreams long after those dreams had crumbled to dust. The years of exile passed for Alcibiades like a slow, tortuous ebb of time. From Sparta to Persia, his journey was one of constant movement. A man always on the run, trying to reassert himself, trying to reclaim the glory that had once been his. The world he had once dominated, both in Athens and beyond, had become a shadowy reflection of its former self. But even in the darkest hours of his exile, Alcibiades never stopped dreaming of a return to the city that had loved him, rejected him, and now, seemingly, forgotten him. In the Spartan courts, Alcibiades had to tread carefully. He was a brilliant strategist, a man whose understanding of warfare could turn the tide of a battle. The Spartans, though bitter enemies of Athens, had come to recognize the value of his expertise. He was a man who had seen the inner workings of Athens' military, and they welcomed him not as an ally, but as a tool. His knowledge of Athens' strategies made him invaluable to the Spartan cause. He was a man whose talents could not be ignored, but whose loyalty could not be fully trusted. Despite the uneasy alliance, Alcibiades found himself in a precarious position in Sparta. He was no longer the charismatic Athenian who could sway crowds with his speeches. He was now a foreigner, a man who had betrayed his own people and sought refuge in the arms of their enemies. Though the Spartans admired his brilliance, they never fully accepted him. He was always an outsider, a reminder of Athens' former glory, a glory that now seemed distant. It was in this moment of isolation, amid the cold stone walls of Sparta, that Alcibiades' thoughts turned once more to Athens. He could not forget the city that had once been his home, that had once revered him as a leader and a hero. The ache of longing grew stronger with each passing day. He knew that his name, tainted by scandal and betrayal, would forever be an obstacle to his return. But he could not shake the hope that one day, Athens might call him back. As fate would have it, that day did come. The Peloponnesian War raged on, with Athens reeling from the losses suffered in Sicily and the constant threats from its enemies. The political climate in Athens was shifting, and the very men who had once driven Alcibiades into exile now found themselves at a crossroads. The war was not going well. Athens needed leadership, a strong figure to rally the city and push back against Sparta's growing dominance. The opportunity for Alcibiades' return presented itself unexpectedly. He had been recalled to advise on military matters, and the timing could not have been more perfect. Athens, in desperation, sought his help, knowing that only someone with his knowledge of both Athens and Sparta's military strategies could turn the tide. The assembly, though reluctant to forgive him for his past transgressions, was willing to overlook his betrayal in the face of their dire circumstances. Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, seized the moment with unbridled enthusiasm. He returned to Athens, welcomed by some with open arms, while others viewed his return with skepticism, remembering the wounds of his past betrayal. But the city, as it always did, needed its heroes, and Alcibiades was a hero in their eyes once again, albeit a deeply flawed one. He had not changed, but Athens, in its desperation, had. As he entered the city, the streets seemed to come alive again with the sound of his name. The crowds cheered, though some in the back of their minds wondered if they were cheering the return of a savior or the return of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Alcibiades stood in the center of the agora, surrounded by his supporters, his once mighty name on the lips of every Athenian. He was back, and with him came the promise of a renewed Athens, the chance to restore the glory that had been lost. But even as Alcibiades basked in the adulation, he could not escape the shadows of his past. His return was not without resistance. The men who had once cast him out now watched him with suspicion. There were whispers in the corners of the assembly, Murmurs of doubt, fear, and resentment. Could a man who had so easily betrayed his city truly be trusted again? Could Athens, in its desperation, afford to place its fate in the hands of such a man? Alcibiades, ever the master of rhetoric, worked tirelessly to regain the trust of Athens. He promised them victories, the restoration of their empire, and a return to the greatness that had once been theirs. He was a man who knew how to charm, how to speak the language of power, and in the midst of the war's chaos, his words held weight. The assembly, in their desperation, gave him command once more. They trusted him, or at least, they had no other choice. But the glory of his return was short-lived. Despite the initial successes that came with his leadership, Alcibiades was once again undone by his own arrogance and the fractured nature of Athenian politics. His decisions, though brilliant at times, were often clouded by his overwhelming desire for personal glory. His enemies, both within Athens and outside of it, found ways to undermine him. The delicate alliances he had built began to crumble, and the cracks in his leadership grew ever wider. In the end, Alcibiades' fate would mirror the very cycle he had so often repeated in his life: rise to power, achieve greatness, and then fall just as spectacularly. His final exile came not from the military failures or political betrayals of others, but from his own inability to adapt to the shifting tides of power in Athens. The city had once again turned its back on him, this time with a finality that left no room for redemption. As he fled the city once more, this time for good, it was clear that Alcibiades' second fall was even more devastating than his first. His return had been a brief, fleeting moment of glory, but it had come at a great cost. The people of Athens, exhausted by the constant shifting of allegiances, had seen enough. Even those who had once placed their hopes in him could no longer ignore the flaws in his character. Hipparete, still in Athens, received the news of his exile with a strange sense of resignation. She had lived through his highs and lows, had seen him rise and fall more times than she could count. But this time, there would be no return. Alcibiades was finished. She had endured so much in silence, had lived through the scandal of his betrayal, and now, at the end of his career, she was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. Alcibiades, the man who had once promised her the world, had proven to be as fleeting and unpredictable as the tides of the sea. His redemption had been brief, his downfall inevitable, and as Athens turned its gaze away from him, Hipparete faced the reality of her own life, one in which she would never be able to escape the shadows of his name, but one in which she would survive, as she always had. The turbulent legacy of Alcibiades cast a long shadow, stretching far beyond his own exile and disgrace. While Athens had moved on, and the great man's name had become synonymous with betrayal, there was still one who carried his blood, a son, the product of a marriage that had once held so much promise. Now reduced to a faint echo in the annals of history, Hipparete's son, born into a world of privilege and expectation, had grown up amid the ruin of his father's reputation. As a child, he had been shielded from much of the scandal surrounding Alcibiades, protected within the walls of his mother's estate. But no amount of shelter could shield him from the whispers that followed his family's name. He was the son of the infamous Alcibiades, and even as a boy, he carried the weight of that name, a name that was both revered and reviled in equal measure. Hipparete, ever the resilient matriarch, did her best to protect her son from the full brunt of the public's judgment. She had raised him to be a man of dignity and honor, hoping that he might one day rise above the shadows of his father's mistakes. She knew, however, that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. How could a son of Alcibiades escape the legacy of failure, betrayal, and scandal? The city of Athens, so quick to condemn, was unforgiving when it came to the sins of the father. Yet despite the overwhelming weight of his heritage, Hipparete's son carried with him the sharp intellect and the potential for greatness that had once marked his father. He was well educated, taught by the best philosophers and rhetoricians Athens had to offer, and while he was often marked as an outsider, a shadow of the man who had once been Athens' greatest hope, there was still a flicker of hope within him that he could find his own path. Separate from the tragedies of his family, In his youth, the city saw glimpses of the brilliance that had once defined Alcibiades. He was a gifted speaker, with a natural charisma that reminded many of his father in his prime. His ability to captivate an audience, to speak with authority and persuasion, set him apart from the other sons of Athens' elite families. Yet, for all his talents, there was always the unspoken question: would he fall into the same traps that had destroyed his father? Would he inherit the same ambition that had led Alcibiades down a path of excess and betrayal? As Hipparete's son reached adulthood, the expectations placed upon him were overwhelming. In Athens, where the political landscape was a constant battlefield, a man's worth was often determined by the deeds of his forefathers. His father's name had once opened doors to the highest echelons of power. But now, it was a barrier. The shadow of Alcibiades' rise and fall loomed over him, casting doubt on his every move. And yet, there were those who saw in him a potential that had been buried beneath the weight of his father's sins. Some in the political circles of Athens, those who had known the brilliance of Alcibiades, took notice of the young man's abilities. They saw a future leader, someone who could restore Athens to its former glory. But as much as they may have admired his talents, they could not escape the memory of Alcibiades, the man who had once been their hero, and who had ultimately betrayed them all. The young man, now of age and standing on the precipice of his future, was faced with a choice: to embrace the legacy of his father and attempt to reclaim the power that had once been his family's birthright, or to distance himself from the past and carve out a new identity, free from the shadows of the Alcibiades name. Hipparete, ever the protective mother, had always hoped for the latter. She had lived through the pain of her husband's rise and fall, and the weight of it had nearly broken her. She could not bear to see her son repeat his father's mistakes. She had raised him to be different, to make decisions that were not driven by the same reckless ambition that had led Alcibiades astray. But as her son grew older, the pull of his father's legacy became stronger. He often spoke of Alcibiades with a mixture of admiration and resentment. He admired his father's brilliance, his ability to inspire and lead, but he also despised the destruction that followed in his wake. His life had been marked by the consequences of Alcibiades' choices, and he struggled to find peace with the fact that he would never be able to escape his father's shadow. The question of whether he would continue the Alcibiades legacy or forge a new path was one that consumed him. The pressure from both the political elite of Athens and his own family weighed heavily on him. There were those who sought to use him as a pawn, hoping to resurrect the glory of the Alcibiades name for their own gain. And yet, there were others who urged him to break free from the chains of his father's legacy, to build a future on his own terms. In the midst of this turmoil, Hipparete watched her son struggle. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the weight of expectations pressing down upon him. She knew that the decision he would make could either redeem their family or doom it forever. But she also knew that, no matter what path he chose, he would never be free from the legacy of his father. Alcibiades' return had been brief, and his second fall had been swift. But the damage to his family's name was permanent. For all the promise and potential that Hipparete's son had, for all his intelligence and skill, he could never fully escape the legacy of a man who had been both a hero and a traitor. The city that had once worshipped Alcibiades would never fully forgive him, nor would it ever forget the son who bore his name. Hipparete's son would never have the chance to become the great leader his father might have been. The politics of Athens, forever shaped by the mistakes of Alcibiades, would not allow it. His legacy, whether he liked it or not, was forever entwined with the tragedy of his father. And as Athens moved on, as new heroes rose and fell, the shadow of Alcibiades and his son remained, a testament to the cost of ambition and the price of betrayal. In the aftermath of Alcibiades' second exile, when the dust had settled and the glory of Athens had long faded from its grand heights, the story of Hipparete remained one of quiet endurance. Athens, as always, moved forward, its political fortunes swaying like the tides of the sea. New leaders rose and fell, but the city's foundations remained unshaken. In contrast, Hipparete's life had become one of silent resilience, an existence that would never be celebrated in the halls of power, but whose impact resonated in the lives of those she had touched. She was a woman who had lived in the shadows of the men around her, never given the chance to step into the limelight, yet always a silent force behind the scenes. Throughout her marriage to Alcibiades, she had watched the powerful tides of Athenian politics ebb and flow. But her own voice, though significant in her family, had never been heard in the assembly, nor in the courts where Athens' future was decided. Her existence had always been tied to the success or failure of her husband, and by extension, her family's legacy. But in the quiet after the storm, there was more to Hipparete than the mere role of a wife and mother. She had endured the betrayal of Alcibiades, not once, but twice, first when he abandoned Athens, and again when he betrayed them with his self-serving return. She had borne the weight of his political mistakes, the consequences of his ambition, and yet she had never faltered. She had maintained the household, ensured the safety and stability of their children, and, in the process, preserved the remnants of their family's once proud legacy. In a city where women were often relegated to the background, where their voices were unheard in the public sphere, Hipparete had done what few could have done. She had survived. She had outlasted the cycles of glory and ruin, witnessing the downfall of the man she had once loved and the rise of a new generation, one that could never quite escape the shadow of the past. While Alcibiades' name was one that would be remembered with a mixture of admiration and disdain, Hipparete's legacy was a quieter one that would never be written in the grand history of Athens, but whose strength would be felt by those who knew her. She had been a mother, a wife, and a symbol of endurance in a world that was shaped by the ambitions and desires of men. Her quiet power was one of survival, not of influence, but in the end, it was no less significant. In the years that followed Alcibiades' final fall, Athens itself began to shift. The political landscape became more fractured, the old order giving way to new ideas and power structures. The glory days of Athens were over, and with them, the memory of Alcibiades and his family began to fade into the background of history. Hipparete, now a woman of advanced years, lived on in the memory of those who had known her, a woman who had endured when others had fallen, who had stood strong when all seemed lost. As she grew older, Hipparete became a quiet figure in the background of Athenian society. She was no longer a young woman of beauty and promise, but rather an elder, a figure of wisdom, respected by those who had witnessed her strength in the face of adversity. Her children, now grown, had found their own paths, though none could escape the legacy of their father. The world they lived in was no longer one where the Alcibiades name could open doors, and their future was uncertain. Hipparete, however, found a strange peace in the passing of time. She had survived, she had raised her children, seen the passing of generations, and watched as Athens moved into a new era. She had given everything to her family and her city, and though her contributions had never been publicly acknowledged, there was a sense of fulfillment in the life she had lived. But there was also a quiet bitterness that lingered beneath the surface. Athens had turned its back on her husband, just as it had turned its back on her. The city had forgotten the woman who had quietly endured the worst of their collective fate. The glory of Alcibiades had faded, and in the wake of his fall, Athens had moved on, seeking new heroes, new idols to worship, and in that forgetting, Hipparete had been lost, a woman whose strength and sacrifice would never be truly recognized. Yet there was a legacy in her quiet strength, a lesson that would not be lost on future generations. While Alcibiades had been a man of ambition, whose every move had been driven by a desire for power, Hipparete had been a woman of resilience, whose every action had been driven by duty and love. She had lived in the margins of history, but in those margins, she had crafted a life of purpose and dignity, one that could never be erased by the failures of those around her. Her legacy would not be found in the grand speeches or the public displays of power that marked the careers of the men of Athens. It would be found in the quiet corners of the city, in the lives of those who had known her, a woman who had survived the storms of life, who had given everything to the family she had loved, and who had carried the weight of her husband's failures without ever asking for recognition. She had been forgotten by history, but in the hearts of those who remembered her, her strength would never fade. And so, in the end, Hipparete became a symbol of a different kind of power, the power of endurance, the power of silence, and the power of a woman who had carried the weight of the world, not on her shoulders, but in her heart, in the annals of history. Her name may never be written in the same bold letters as Alcibiades, but it was no less significant. For in the quiet shadows of history, there are stories of resilience and strength that endure long after the world has forgotten. And in that quiet, Hipparete's legacy lived on, a testament to the strength of a woman who had quietly shaped the fate of those around her. History is a curious thing. It is shaped by the decisions made by the powerful, the voices that echo through time, and the narratives that are crafted to preserve the legacies of those who hold sway over the fate of nations. But there is always a question that lingers, one that never seems to be answered. What if things had been different? What if the tides of fate had shifted just slightly, and the course of history had taken a turn in another direction? In the case of Hipparete and Alcibiades, this question hangs heavily in the air. What if she had taken a different path? One that was not defined by the loyalty to a man who would ultimately bring ruin to them both. What if, instead of enduring the public disgrace, she had chosen to leave Alcibiades, to sever ties with a man who had not only betrayed Athens, but had left her to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives? Could Athens have been different? Could Alcibiades have found redemption? Or would his fate have remained sealed no matter the choices made by those around him? What if, when Alcibiades was first exiled, Hipparete had taken her children and fled to a distant land, far from the politics of Athens? What if she had sought to build a new life for herself, untethered from the ruin that was tied to her husband's name? In that scenario, perhaps Alcibiades would have remained in exile, his name fading into the distant past. Perhaps Athens, free from his influence, might have found a new leader, one who could steer the city away from the chaos and turmoil that followed in the wake of his ambition. But could Athens have ever truly escaped the shadow of Alcibiades? The city had built its power and its identity on the backs of men like him. Was there anyone who could have matched his brilliance, his charisma, his ability to command both loyalty and fear? Would Athens have been able to recover without the figure who had once embodied its very spirit? Would it have fallen sooner to Sparta, or to the shifting political currents of the time? Even if Hipparete had chosen a different path, one away from her husband's destructive ambition, the question remains, would Alcibiades ever have been truly able to change? Could he, a man whose ambitions were as boundless as the sea, ever have found peace? Or would his quest for power have inevitably led him to the same end? His downfall, after all, had been as much a part of his nature as his rise. His ambition was insatiable, his thirst for greatness unquenchable. No matter how many times he was exiled, no matter how many times Athens had cast him out, he had always managed to return, convinced that his destiny was to rule. Could anyone have stopped him? But what of Hipparete? If she had walked away, if she had been more than the dutiful wife, the woman who endured and persevered in silence, could she have found happiness or fulfillment outside of her marriage? Would she have been remembered as more than just the wife of a man who failed? Would she have been remembered at all? Would history have cared about the woman who stood behind the scenes, silently supporting, enduring, but never letting? Perhaps there was a world where Hipparete could have stepped out of the shadows, where she could have used her own intelligence and wisdom to shape her own path. She was no less capable than the men around her. She had seen the inner workings of Athenian politics, had witnessed the games played in the assembly, and had survived them all. She had the potential to be a leader, to influence the direction of the city in ways that would have rivaled any male counterpart. But in the world she inhabited, there was no room for such a woman. She was relegated to the domestic sphere, to a life defined by her association with Alcibiades, and in the end, that was the legacy she carried. Yet, what if the tides of history had been different? What if Athens had recognized the strength in women like Hipparete? What if the city had granted her the same power it afforded its male citizens, allowing her to take the reins of her own life, to forge a future for her children that was not tied to the mistakes of the past? It is a tantalizing thought, one that will never be realized. The society in which Hipparete lived had no place for a woman like her. She was trapped in a world where her worth was measured by her relationship to the men around her. But what if, in some alternate history, Athens had been more progressive, more willing to allow women to wield power in their own right? In such a world, perhaps Hipparete would have taken the lead, not as a passive figure in the background of her husband's life, but as an active participant in shaping the future of Athens. Perhaps she would have been remembered not as the wife of Alcibiades, but as a leader in her own right, whose quiet strength had shaped the course of history. She could have been a voice for women, for the silenced, for those who were forgotten by the grand narratives of the men who wrote history. Yet, in the end, history is not shaped by what might have been, but by what was. Alcibiades' name would echo through the ages, remembered as both hero and traitor, his rise and fall etched in the collective memory of Athens. Hipparete's name would fade, lost to the passage of time, remembered only as the woman who stood by him, who bore the weight of his mistakes, and who silently ensured the survival of their family in a city that had forgotten her. What if? It is a question that will never be answered, but it is one that lingers in the air, a reminder that history is not just shaped by those who hold power, but also by those who endure in silence, whose stories go untold, and in that silence, perhaps there is power, power that can never be fully realized in a world that refuses to listen. As the years stretched on, Athens, like the rest of the ancient world, entered a period of transformation. The great empire, once a beacon of democracy and culture, slowly began to fade. The Peloponnesian War had worn down the city's strength, and while new leaders rose and fell, none could recapture the greatness that had once been epitomized by figures like Alcibiades. The city itself, bruised and broken, was left to rebuild. But the legends of the past were fading into myth, their echoes growing quieter with every passing generation. In the grand scheme of things, Hipparete's life was but a footnote in the history of Athens. She was not immortalized in the history books or sung about in the epic poems of the day. Her name would not be remembered as one of the women who changed the course of history, nor would it be celebrated in the same breath as the political titans and military leaders who had shaped the city's destiny. She was a woman lost in time, whose legacy would remain hidden in the cracks of history, obscured by the grandeur of her husband's rise and fall. Yet, there was a quiet power in her story. It was not a power that could be seen from the front lines of battle, nor one that could be captured in a statue erected in her honor. It was the power of resilience, of survival, of a woman who, despite all odds, had endured a life that would have broken others. She had lived through the political turbulence of her time, supported her family, and weathered the scorn of a city that had once adored her husband. She had borne the weight of a marriage that was never her choice. And through it all, she had continued, silent, but unbroken. Hipparete's legacy was not in the dramatic gestures of power or the public triumphs that marked the lives of the men around her. Her power was in the quiet moments, the moments where she held her family together in the face of scandal and disgrace, where she ensured that her children could carry on with dignity, despite the taint of their father's name. She was a woman who had never been given the opportunity to shape history with her own hands, but she had shaped the lives of those she loved with her strength, her loyalty, and her quiet determination. When she passed, the city of Athens moved on, as cities always do. Her death went largely unnoticed, a brief moment of sadness in the lives of those who had known her. But in the hearts of her children, in the hearts of those who had witnessed her quiet strength, she was remembered. She was remembered not as the wife of Alcibiades, not as the woman who had silently endured the whims of a man whose ambition had ruined them both. She was remembered as a mother, a wife, and a woman who had lived a life of dignity in a world that had offered her none. And so, the story of Hipparete fades into the mist of time, not as a tale of triumph or glory, but as a story of endurance. A woman who survived the political storms of Athens, who weathered the betrayals and heartbreaks of her marriage, and who carried the weight of her family's legacy when no one else could. Though her name may be lost to history, her story is one of quiet power that resonates through the ages. For in the end, it is not the grand battles or the heroic speeches that define the course of history. Sometimes, it is the women who endure in the background, the ones who carry on through hardship, who stand silently by their families, who hold the fabric of society together. that leave the most lasting mark on the world. Hipparete may have been forgotten by the pages of history, but she was never forgotten by those who truly understood the value of resilience, of quiet strength in the face of adversity. As the years go on and the names of the great men and women of Athens fade into myth, it is stories like hers that remind us of the unsung heroes, the ones who never sought the spotlight, but whose lives were no less significant for it. And in the end, Hipparete's legacy was not one of fame, but of survival, of the power of endurance in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. The woman lost in time, yet never truly forgotten, would remain in the hearts of those who understood what it meant to stand strong when the world around you was falling apart. And that, in the end, is where true power lies.